Hello and welcome to another episode of the Strength Syndicate podcast with myself, Shane Story, and my co-host, Lawrence King. Today, we are joined by a very special guest. So today we have Dr. Eric Helms on the podcast. So Mr. Helms he's a lot of things. He's a researcher at Auckland University. He is also the head of science at 3DMJ. He's a pro natural bodybuilder, powerlifting coach, and just all around wizard. So
that's good.
I'll get Eric. There is going to be actually people who listen to this who don't know who you are. So could you tell them a little bit about yourself?
No, I'd love to. And thank you so much for having me on. True privilege and honor. One minor clarification. I am a research fellow at the Auckland University of Technology. Oh. Auckland University, that's our mortal enemy. So I would never collaborate or work with them. No, I'm just kidding. That's all good. I did my graduate or postgraduate work, I should say, here in New Zealand at AUT. I came out here to study sports science because it seemed like a really interesting place to do that. Great people. And I was so right that I just was like, man, I never want to leave. My wife and I had been here in New Zealand. You can probably tell, but I don't sound quite Kiwi. But we came here in 2012. I've had the pleasure, privilege, and honor of staying here since. So it's been almost a decade now. We've been in New Zealand. So in my kind of in-person world, I get to work with master's and PhD students who are interested in strength and physique sports science, which is kind of the little niche area that I'm in, the master's and PhD level. But long before I got into academia, I was an athlete first, still am, and then a coach, and now I act as kind of a science advisor, consultant, and researcher in addition to those things. And I have my fingers in a lot of pies. So I'm the chief science officer at 3D Muscle Journey, like you mentioned, which is a company where our mission is to support drug-free lifters. And we do that pretty broadly. So we have the 4 coaches, we have our support staff, our RD, Steve Taylor, we got our mental health specialist, Amanda Rizzo, and we've got our chief operations manager, Andrea Valdez, as well as our doctor of physical therapy, Nick Licamelli. We all produce content and work with people. And it's kind of my job to make sure that we're up to date with the evidence. And I also do a little bit of coaching that I never want to stop doing that, but it's not my main gig these days. I do podcasts. I host some too, instead of just appearing on them with messy hair like I'm doing here today. And produce scientific articles in mass, monthly applications to strength sport, try to keep my books up to date. And generally, I just kind of do the whole science communication gig and make sure that that the tide is rising all ships, if you will. But yeah, I'm still just the meathead at heart. So I compete in natural bodybuilding and multidisciplinary strength sport and have been doing that since my first powerlifting competition in 2006.
So you're an OG, so you never got into single ply gear at all, did you?
No, I popped in right at the reemergence of raw lifting. So I was in the first meet I ever did was like an unsanctioned one at the YMCA where I was a personal trainer. Nice. When I was still just gotten out of the military. I was still in Georgia in the South. And there was a federation that was growing, I think it was called 100% Raw in that area.
Oh, yeah.
It was an unsanctioned fed. I was like, oh, interesting, Raw, what's that? And that's when I learned that powerlifting was, just a year prior, or even still at that time, very dominated by the voices of West Side in multiply. And I was like, look, I'm interested in strength and bodybuilding. Like, I don't want to really, like, I no hate it at all. It's just not my thing. Like, I want to kind of see the combined factors of strength and muscular development. And when I moved back to California, where I'm originally from with my wife, when she finished her enlistment in the Air Force, that was in late 2006, there was a great gym, Body Tribe Fitness, that was ran by Chip Conrad, and he had a connection with the American Powerlifting Association, which always had a raw division. And eventually that meet became completely raw. And when in the year that happened, the meet doubled in size. And that was around 2000, I want to say 8 or 9. So that was kind of right around the time everyone's going,
there's this raw thing.
Absolutely.
So just kind of, I suppose, one thing I'm always interested in from people is like, what got you into lifting? When did you start? Kind of, I suppose, just go back.
Absolutely, yeah. So my lifting is almost 18. So I nearly have an adult lifter inside of me, but I still make some poor decisions, you know. So '04 was when I started lifting. I was still in the Air Force. I went through a rather tough time personally and interpersonally with the relationship I was in, and I needed some type of outlet that was healthy. And I wouldn't say lifting started healthy. It was definitely, 2 doses of masochism and maybe 1 dose of healthy exercise. But quickly it became something that I was able to not just kind of, deal with my demons, as they might say, but also, become a positive expression and something where I built self-efficacy and took it, as far as most people take it who are interested in getting strong and big. And then I wonder if I can take this further. And then I started looking into competitive outlets. And then when I did my first season actually, to be honest, when I did my first powerlifting competition, I was like, this is so cool. And when I did my first bodybuilding season, I was like, this is incredible. And I have an eating disorder, but, pros and cons. And that was what really made me realize that, at least for competitive bodybuilding, and I've come to see it can be for strength sport as well, if you get very numbers focused, there are potential downsides emotionally, mentally, and physically as well. So that's kind of where my interest in trying to help athletes find more sustainability in their approach, mentally, physically, and kind of ensuring that people can stop competition on their terms rather than getting burned out or finding it's just not something they can do healthily, or an injury, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, I think I remember reading the revised muscle strength pyramids, and like one different thing, or one thing that was added to that, was about like how you could make a lot of this more sustainable, and adopting more kind of practices that you could implement long term, as opposed to like moving away from the kind of numbers based approach that maybe was very popular like 5-10 years ago.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, then I'm assuming, and correct me if I'm wrong, you're referring to a lot of the minimal or non-tracking approaches that I suggested nutritionally in the pyramid. Awesome. Yeah, it's an interesting thing. All of our experiences are relative to what we've already experienced, right? So when I got into the game, as you mentioned, I'm an OG. I'm sure there are some who are far more O than my OG, 90s, 80s, who are still around and producing great content. But I've been in it long enough now that I have seen substantial changes and things coming full circle. And at the time when I was first reading content in the mid 2000s and figuring out how to do things for myself, which of course then translated to how I acted as a coach and a personal trainer, which I was until 2010. From basically '05 to 2010 or 11, I was an in-person personal trainer. The better approach, the more sustainable approach to eat a very, very strict meal plan, sometimes with arbitrary, unfounded rules, like you can't combine carbs and fats, you can't eat after 6 p.m. or whatever, was let's track macros, because now you have food selection freedom, right? And there wasn't really any other tool at the time. And that was probably kind of the perspective until the early 2010s, was that it's either chicken and broccoli and strict meal timing and live out of Tupperware, or have a little more food freedom and track macros. And that was kind of the people like preaching moderation. And of course, as we've seen, especially if we step outside of a very small circle in the strength sport world and the kind of the evidence-based community or whatever, that, in the general population and in people with disordered eating patterns, tracking is something that's definitely not new. And it's just one other thing to potentially have a kind of neurotic approach to. So I was, as I became more educated on this topic, and of course, thinking back to my own experiences and figuring out ways to do it differently and engaging with the research, I was like, this is something like we need to have different tools in our tool belt here to make sure that we can serve, a broader collection of people. and make sure what we're doing is actually sustainable, not just something that's shitty, but better than, what we were doing before. Not the tracking is shitty, but it's something that can be used in a way that has downsides. And there's a big difference between rigidly tracking purposefully all the time to hit specific targets versus simply tracking what you're eating to have an awareness of where you're at, but modulating it based on, your day-to-day hunger levels, activity, et cetera, what have you. And what information you see when you get it. If you go over, is that, oh my God, I've blown it? Or is that information for you? So anyway, a bit of a tangent, but 100%. That's a great example of trying to make sure that I stay up to date with best practice to ensure that what I am recommending is actually sustainable.
Yeah, 100% agree. But I suppose we better move on to the topic that we're going to discuss. So obviously you have practical experience with bodybuilding and with powerlifting, both like with yourself and also with coaching people. So I suppose we wanted to touch on today about how do you compete as a dual sport athlete in both powerlifting and bodybuilding. So I think a good place that we could start off with would be like training differences. So like obviously there are some clear cut differences between, what a powerlifter needs to do in terms of competition. The different a bodybuilder doesn't really have any kind of clear cut thing they need to do in training. Like, they could do a lot. So could you kind of maybe touch a little bit on that and the specific thing that, like maybe the specific adaptations to opposed demand and like how that would kind of practically apply to a bodybuilder and how it would apply to a powerlifter?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think starting with the differences is an easy way to figure out where there can be overlap, and you can try to have your cake and eat it too. I guess you don't have to have cake if you're doing bodybuilding, but you get my analogy.
Yeah.
So,
or tracking recommendations, I suppose, maybe.
That's right. Yeah, it depends on off season, maybe, and only if you hate yourself after you eat it. So that's an important component to bodybuilding diets is self-loathing. Okay, but in all seriousness, so you're right. Bodybuilding is really just about you're just basically a muscle farmer, right? So you put in a stimulus, you make sure it grows, you tend your crop, right? But there are so many ways to stimulate your quadriceps. There are no movement requirements. You can find bodybuilders who train like powerlifters with more reps and accessory movements, your classic kind of, Ronnie Coleman approach, or if we take it further back, Franco, even further back than that, we almost see a complete merging of the two as we get into the 50s, and probably better to state a merging of strength sport and bodybuilding, because at that time, powerlifting wasn't really a thing. But if we look at weightlifting at the time, weightlifters were bodybuilders and vice versa. So I guess that's interesting, right? So I could do leg press or I could squat, and there's no clear cut, at least anecdotally, reason why any one would be better than the other. There are multiple tools that can both get the job done. Same thing goes for chest development. Same thing goes for erector development. We think about the big three and glutes and hamstrings and all that good stuff. So the bodybuilders have always had the power lifts in their arsenal as potential tools that they can use. And that's great, because that makes for a potential marriage of the two, because there are some restrictions on what you must do as a powerlifter. I mentioned earlier the West Side Gang, back in the mid 2000s, and even prior to that, they were by far the most dominant voice in powerlifting, and there was a way to do things. However, in the powerlifting world, you would take their quote unquote conjugate approach, where, every few weeks you would rotate out some variation on the main lifts. You might add bands, you might add chains, you might squat and squat briefs. There was a whole different version for raw lifters. You have dynamic effort days, etc. And you go, that's totally different than, say, this approach, which has more quote unquote specificity. But that is very much a view of someone inside powerlifting. If you were to ask anyone who was not a powerlifter, it would all look highly specific. Like, I don't really care that there's some chains on it. All you do is bench, squat, deadlift. And what do? Yeah, they don't use the chains, but I mean, come on, it's really you are always doing these same three movements or close variations. But there's a board there. Like, come on, So from the perspective of an outsider, and from just really looking at it kind of from stripped down biomechanics, it's pretty clear, no matter what camp you're in powerlifting, you have to do a reasonably high frequency of the squat, bench, and deadlift to get good at the squat, bench, and deadlift. So there is a movement requirement in powerlifting. We can quibble over how specific you need to be, what the frequency or volume needs to be, what proportion needs to be the comp lift in comp form, or other approaches. But ultimately, we know that we need to treat those three movements like skills that we develop over time, and that there are benchmarks for strength performance. So then the question is, well, all right, how can I do that and marry that with me needing to prioritize all muscles equally and get yiggity yacked everywhere, you know? And that's something that I think is not that hard to do. You can just simply, I mean, there's a lot of different approaches we can talk about, so I won't just jump into that. But based on your question, I think the big differences are that the requirement of powerlifting is you must do these three movements. The requirement of bodybuilding is that you're trying to get as big as possible. The interesting overlaps, which I'll use to kind of seed where we go from here, is that the big three are viable movements for bodybuilding, which is great. And in powerlifting, when we look at cross-sectional comparisons in research, what differentiates powerlifters of different levels, we see that the strongest single factor, not that there's only one factor, but if we were to want to have the closest thing to a smoking gun, is muscle size. You can express that as thickness, lean body mass, cross-sectional area. And when you look at that across various strength sports, whether it be it weightlifters, strong men and women, powerlifting, we all see that by far the factor that seems most closely related statistically with maximal strength is how jacked are you?
Yeah, and I suppose especially if you were even anecdotally, it's no surprise when if someone was to go to their first meet, or if someone was to look at IPF Worlds, generally an awful lot of people that are standing on podiums, particularly in categories where there's weight class limits, the people at the upper limits of those weight classes are incredibly lean in the 74s, the 83s, the 93s. So I suppose it does make entirely sense, even if people weren't too aware of the literature.
100%.
So then kind of for you, I suppose, coming out of kind of the small differences in training, coming out of the big differences, I suppose, in training, what are the kind of minutiae, I suppose, what are the differences when you're approaching, say, a bodybuilding prep versus a powerlifting prep and volume? So maybe we could talk a little bit about the differences in volume, maybe of the big three. What do you prioritize coming into a powerlifting meet versus what you prioritize coming into a powerlifting comp? I suppose a powerlifting comp is more kind of obvious, I suppose, because we all know coming into a comp, higher proportion of your total weekly volume is going to be going towards the big three, whereas in bodybuilding it's a little bit less clear. So maybe you want to talk through that.
Yeah, the bodybuilder probably shouldn't even consider those three movements the big three. You know, they don't necessarily benefit from kind of having a bias of thinking, hey, those are the main lifts. Maybe if they're a dual sport athlete, they would, but I think it's good to talk about, you know, where does training stress come from? And then, you know, how does it influence adaptation? So training stress, if we were to kind of talk in big picture terms without too much nuance, it comes down to the load and the volume that you train at, right? The combination of those is going to produce how much training stress and the type of adaptations and their magnitude. So the interesting thing is that load is far more influential for powerlifting, while volume is more influential for hypertrophy. So what we've seen is that when you meta-analyze how many sets are performed, and when we look at the research on volume, we see that there are relationships, a dose-response relationship, where the more you do, the more you get, not linear, and very diminishing in terms of how much you get. So for example, the first couple sets might give you half to 2/3 the gains you can possibly get. You might have to get closer to, say, 8 to 12 sets before you're getting all of the possible gains. So, you know, 3 times as much volume, 30% more gains, right? It's not non-linear. May or may not be worth it depending on the person and their time investment, injury risk, et cetera, all that other nuance. But the relationship with hypertrophy is pretty clear, you know, and it is significant when you compare different brackets, like 1 to 4 sets, 5 to 9 sets, 10 plus sets. You know, it takes 10 plus to get to, say, around 100% on average. This is talking about a population, not an individual here. You can get around 80% of that doing kind of that 5 to 9, but you get like 2/3 of it doing 1 to 4. However, for strength, we're talking about 1 RM. That relationship is far less significant. In fact, in some cases, it doesn't reach significance, and the effect sizes are trivial. You can get actually around 80% of the maximal strength gains you could get from doing far more volume with just the first 1 to 4 sets. So that's really interesting. However, what is not like that is load. There are very clear differences between moderate load and high load training. Training, say, below 60% of 1 RM and training above 60% of 1 RM. So we know that lifting heavy, unsurprisingly, makes you better at lifting heavy things, right? But the actual size of muscle requires a fair amount of work. And this helps us understand why you can see some champion level powerlifters who train far less frequently and with far less volume than other powerlifters. But when you get into the bodybuilding world, at least if we're talking about competitive bodybuilders, not just people who are promoting programs to gain size, even the quote unquote low volume folks, like let's say a Dorian Yates, is still doing a fair amount of volume. It's certainly on the low end of the spectrum, but we're still talking about 8 sets per muscle group and at a very high proximity to, or I should say 2 or past failure. So anyway, yeah, important key aspect there. Each unit of volume is therefore more stressful. So that makes things a little more challenging, right? Okay, now we understand that if I want to get good at the big 3, not only do I have to do them, but I got to do them heavy, but I also have to find a way to get volume on all the muscle groups. And this is essentially where something that emerges is a periodization plan where you go through different blocks. And I think the approach that one shouldn't take, that maybe was kind of the quote unquote standard power building approach from a decade ago, which is fine if you're a beginner or an intermediate, is to basically just try to do both all the time, right? I'm just going to do the 5x5 on the big 3 because that's sufficient volume and strength, and then I'll do some accessory work, and then sometimes on top of that I'll do triples or singles and try to peak for strength. That's a lot. You're hammering yourself from both ends of what contributes to training stress. And the question becomes, okay, are there ways to do it better? And the answer is probably yes. So the cool thing about strength is that because it's not so closely associated with volume and it's heavily influenced by load, is that if you take a highly specific approach, you can use a very low dose. So I was part of some really cool research that was led by PAC, Androulakis Korakakis.
Yeah, we had PAC weeks ago. He's a fierce nice fellow, but his research, it was just excellent.
He did a fantastic job. Working out with James Steele, who's a fantastic researcher. They took pretty high level powerlifters as far as the research is concerned. I would say you're like a standard competitive powerlifter, which is a perfect audience for what we're talking about, and had them do a stripped down bare minimum approach of simply working up to a single at a 9 to 9.5 RPE. So we're talking like heavy second attempt, right? Like a daily max, if you will. And they had them work up to a single on bench 3 times a week, a single on squats twice a week, and deadlift once a week, and nothing else. That's it. So we're talking 6 total sets per week of 1 rep, if we don't count the warm-ups. And they found that that was actually sufficient to make suboptimal gains on the bench and squat in most people, and for a good chunk of people on the deadlift, and to make pretty good gains if we were to poll a bunch, and this is exactly what he did. If you poll a bunch of coaches and powerlifters and say, hey, what's a good amount of progress to make in 6 weeks? If you were to simply do 2 sets of 3 at 80% of that single on each one of those days, add that on top of that, the average powerlifter will make greater than those polled amounts of what's good gains in the squat, bench, and deadlift. So now we're talking about a workout program that if you just did that, you'd be out of the gym in 30 minutes, 3 times a week.
I thought that was
pretty cool.
Deal.
One of the research was that he actually qualitatively assessed, come here lads, what's actually the minimum amount of progress you'd like to see in 12 weeks or 6 weeks or something like that. I thought that was such a cool inclusion in the research, because it's something like, he did ask a little bit on what coaches' perception, I suppose, of minimum effective dose was, and he got kind of lots of interesting stuff back in it. But even that the inclusion of some qual in that kind of research I thought was really relevant.
100%. So that's a really interesting finding. That means, so let's go back to that kind of periodization model. A common theme in periodization is one of the quote unquote problems that we try to get around is that we know that there are various physiological adaptations that have the potential to help performance, and it's difficult to train for all of them simultaneously. And how do we prevent decay in one of those adaptations while we go for something else? So argued approaches have been undulating periodization, or we always keep some element, but we separate them on different days or weeks, daily undulating or weekly undulating periodization. And then we just bias the proportion towards the phase we're currently in. The traditional approach is linear periodization or Western periodization, where you'd spend large chunks of time in each one, when that created the quote unquote problem we need to solve. I keep saying quote unquote, because there's just not a lot of actually direct research long enough to really make strong statements about periodization. But that's the theory behind it, and it at least holds up logically to some degree. Other approaches, block periodization, which is basically getting through the whole old school linear approach in just a period of 12 weeks. So it's just not enough time for decay. And that's kind of some combination of undulating and block periodization is what most powerlifters do. They wake up and they go, oh shit, I'm 12 weeks out from a meet. Let me set this shit up, and then for the first 4 to 6 weeks, they're training higher rep and doing higher volumes with lower loads, building some momentum, and then they start dropping volume, getting more specific, adding in singles, and then they taper and they compete. That's your stock standard approach. And I think it's a pretty good approach. So then we go, okay, well, hold on. If I really want to focus on muscle size and I need to be doing volume, and maybe this big three aren't the best vehicle for that volume. Maybe I don't want to be doing 4 sets of 10 on squats, bench, and deadlift, because A, I don't hate myself, and B, I don't like to be injured, and C, there's a lot of other movements and muscles out there. Like how do I train my rec fem or the biceps femoral short head if I'm just doing squats and deadlifts from what we know about biarticular muscles, right? We actually know that different heads of the pectoralis major get emphasized to different degrees. The pros were always right at different angles, I've got biceps, I've got calves, all this stuff, right? So that means, okay, well, I don't want to backslide in my strength. So I've got this study from PAC that says just doing that 2-3-1 approach of singles only, not even let the back off work, I should at least hold the line. And I actually should be making gains on the squat and bench, at least on average. So you can come up with this approach where you think about what is the minimum effective dose for me to at least maintain or massively slow the decay of strength loss when I go through a phase that's heavily emphasizing bodybuilding. Vice versa, what's the minimum amount I need to do to maintain my muscle size while emphasizing strength? And what emerges from that is this phasic approach. And that's basically how I train when I'm doing, for my goals, is during a bodybuilding block, I'll make sure that at least, half the mesocycles, I'm doing a single at a moderate RPE on the big three, at least once a week. And you'd be surprised just how effective that is at maintaining, the strength levels I have. Likewise, when I'm, competing, and I'm actually prepping. I had that moment. I woke up 12 weeks out from nationals, like, oh shit, actually got to think about this. I'm still doing like cable rows and pull downs and all the quote unquote accessories, but maybe focusing on things that might not even be supportive to the lifts, like bicep curls or calf raises, hamstring curls, things like that. And then I'm figuring out what's the least amount I could get away with doing as I peak, so I can be in a very prepared state with low fatigue. And knowing, how much detraining am I likely to experience in the last 3 weeks, I'm really not doing any of it. It's not a big deal. I can actually keep a fair amount with just the squat, bench, and deadlift, and it comes back rapidly. So understanding all of those factors allows you to start to periodize it. Because the way I used to do it from like, say, 2006 to even maybe 2013 or 14 was just do it all. And well, I had hip surgery, so I mean, you learn things. I went through a period where I was trying to compete in weightlifting and powerlifting simultaneously, while also trying to make improvements from a bodybuilding perspective. And the combination of snatches, heavy cleans for me, low bar squats and deadlifts, and also doing a bunch of accessory movements, it really burned me out. And I think probably doing a PhD simultaneously did as well. But from just a pure biomechanical perspective, my hips didn't lie. Much like we've heard through popular songs. And I was starting to feel it, boy, And I needed eventually some actual surgical intervention, which fortunately worked very well for me. And from then, that return to my prior strength levels, I noticed with a very minimum effective dose approach, I was able to get within 16 weeks of getting surgery, bilateral, hip surgery. I was back up and above my old strength levels. And it made me realize just how maybe the approach I was taking was effective, but it was kind of like, there's a fly on the wall. There's a fly swatter there. Nope, grenade. That's kind of the approach I was taking, is just do all of it all the time until you either get stronger or break, which I don't recommend.
Until the wheels kind of come off. I suppose that's that, when a lot of us were kind of originally exposed to bodybuilding, maybe in, I don't know, when we were young, maybe 15, 16, there's that survivorship bias, I suppose, of people that have been in it long enough to tolerate those loads, tolerate those volumes.
All the stupid stuff.
Yeah, all the stupid stuff. They were the ones that kind of hung in. So I suppose it's kind of good that, well, good in a way that happened to you, at least, I suppose, or we would be talking to you in the capacity that you are. So kind of for you, kind of being dual sport, what does your yearly plan look like? Are you a guy that you'll just decide, okay, I have an itch now to do a meet, and you'll just dedicate, say, January to, I don't know, June for prep for a meet, and then once that's wrapped up, you're like, okay, we're bodybuilding mode? Or are you more kind of, I won't say laissez-faire, but you're just kind of like relaxed, I suppose, with it, and it's just when it happens, it happens?
Great question. Yeah, and I think there's two factors there. Is that bodybuilding is not just about getting big. It's also about getting incredibly shredded for the stage when you want to actually compete. And that, unfortunately, comes with significant physiological and psychological cost. That's why there's a recovery phase that you'll see in the research. How long does it take someone to get, back to having their menstrual cycle?
Yeah.
How long does it take you to go from having hypogonadal levels of testosterone to normal again that we measured at baseline? We've got a number of case studies that look at this. How long does it take for your POM score, your profile of mood states, that is now 7-fold worse than it was at baseline, to get back to something reasonable? How long does it take for your strength to recover, right? Which has an impact on being a dual sport athlete. So that's one factor, is that when you throw in competitive bodybuilding, not just like, I want to look, you get a yacked on the beach, you have to consider how that is going to impact your timelines. And then the other factor is you also have to think, how close am I to my potential? Which, is a question you see all the time on the internet. But once you've been in the game long enough, pushing progressively and improving, you do start to see this from a just kind of insecurity perspective of, what's reasonable for me where do I expect myself to be in 5 years or in 10 years? To give some perspective, I set aside 2020 and 2021 as me going, let's really take strength sports seriously. For 2020, I tried to do the whole everything thing. I wouldn't call it laissez-faire. It actually took a lot of planning. And then, of course, COVID just blew it up, right? So I started the year off. I was training in the end of 2019. I finished my bodybuilding season. The last time I competed in bodybuilding was 2019. Did my last show in August. And I was like, hey, I want to actually get into strongman. And I did two, I'm going to call them events. They weren't proper full meets. They didn't have like the 4 or 5 events. But I did the kind of strongman equivalent of a powerlifting meet, where you do log and you do like a strongman deadlift. And then I also did
static monsters.
Yeah, it was very similar to that. It wasn't exactly static monsters, but I did a very, very similar. Like, it might as well have been static monsters.
Like the stuff, either an axle deadlift or an overhead log press.
Exactly. So ours was just a straight up, straps conventional deadlift with hitching allowed, and then a log press. That was my second comp. Before that, there was the organizers here had a little kind of cool exhibition event where there was a stone max stone, and then anyone who wanted to compete in a truck pull. So it was actually a tractor pull. But so anyway, I did that, and I did the static monsters, and I was like, this is pretty cool. I want to do a proper full day, strongman meet with 4 or 5 events. And I also want to do a powerlifting meet. I also want to do a weightlifting meet in the same year. I want to do the trifecta. So then COVID happened. All the competitions got canceled. Everything got blown up. I didn't have access to train with this stuff. All I had was 90 kilos and a barbell. And as I mentioned off camera, me digging divots into Western Park in the ground. Apologies, Ponsonby residents, if you tripped. And I was like, all right, well, I'm going to try to still accomplish this goal, but I don't know when we're going to get out of lockdown. And I'm going to focus a lot on weightlifting because I've only got 90 kilos. And shit, the most I've ever snatched is 90 kilos. So I think, and that was like a crappy power clean way back in the day. Crappy power snatch way back in the day with definite press out. So let me really get serious about weightlifting. And I did a couple of weightlifting comps. And then when the situation was better, I was like, oh shit, I can jump into a powerlifting meet in November. And this is kind of that laissez-faire thing. Like, what meets are going to be left? What's going on? When are we in lockdown? We got out of lockdown in August. And I started shifting. I did my last weightlifting comp in either late September or early October. And then I had 6 weeks to prepare for a powerlifting meet. And I jumped directly into a singles approach where I went from that 2-3-1 to a 3-4-2 to a 5-4-3, like over like two week block, tapered. And I jumped in and I was like, whoa, this really worked. I hit a 600 kilo total. And my best to date is like 622. So I got to within 95% of my best strength levels within just a 6-week prep, after having spent all of 2020 and 2019 really not focused specifically on powerlifting, coming out of a diet, focusing on strongman, and then being in lockdown with only access to 90 kilos and a 24 kilo dumbbell, and doing like handstand push-ups and shit like that. So that really showed me the benefit of specificity. And then I found out, hey, in another 4 weeks in December, there's this Highland Games competition, and I jumped into that. And that was and I had a little bit of time to prep, barely got any practice on most of the implements, but it was a lot of fun. So I managed to compete in 3 strength sports in a single year, but it wasn't intended to be laissez-faire. I had the whole thing planned out, beforehand based on the competition schedule. And I can tell you that you can do it, but essentially you have to be more mentally engaged with preparedness and being an all-around athlete. I think it's what a lot of say CrossFit competitors like. Like, I may not be peaked for any single one of these events, but any day on the street, you throw me into something, I can do a decent, assault bike. I can do a decent clean, like my 1 hour minimums instead of my 1 rep maxes are kind of what we're looking at. And I've closed the gap between those two. So like any given day, I'm ready to go and be slightly above average. Like that has to be kind of your motivation if you want to take that laissez-faire approach. Or you need to be a novice to where getting better at cleans will actually improve your deadlift. Cleans don't improve my deadlift. That's something I found out. And like, for example, I would say high bar squats don't even transfer that much anymore to my low bar squats because I do them quite differently. Overhead press doesn't transfer to my bench press very effectively anymore. There was a time when they did, but now that I am very specific in the way that I perform all these movements, and they have very distinct patterns, and I have a fair amount of muscle mass, that whole transfer thing, it gets a little more complicated. So early on, just jump in, do it all, have fun, just don't get hurt and don't overtrain. Great. But you're going to get to a point where you look up and you go, okay, what do I reasonably think it will take for me to set PRs? And so that experience in 2020 led me to go and look at 2021 and go, all right, I want to finally squat 500 pounds. I want to go into a meet. I want to try to total over 1400, or that's like 637 or something like that. I want to be a mediocre powerlifter in the 93 kilo class was my goal for 2021. And I achieved that, but it took me from January till, the end of 2020, after I did that last Olympic weightlifting meet. So basically 11 months of total training And I finally hit a 227 or 501 squat. I benched 155, which was also a PR. And I deadlifted 260 in a meet earlier in the year. So I hit a PR in all 3 lifts in 2021. But it took me training highly specifically for powerlifting, really no weightlifting, no strongman, and just a minimum amount to kind of hold my current level of muscle mass. And that's because I've been powerlifting since 06. And like, while I rapidly went from, say, like an 1100 total to a 1200 total, and then kind of slowly went to 1300, me now approaching a 1400 total, I can tell I'm starting to fill up the whole size of my strength plate. I'm just not built for it. I've got tiny bones. I'm 6 foot, and I compete in bodybuilding at 80 kilos. I'm much prettier than I am strong. I'll admit that. So the abilities of me as a strength athlete, I know it takes a lot of work to get into being able to move at all. So that is now a concern. So like, when I think of it now, I go, all right, if I want to do well in powerlifting and actually improve, I can't look like, oh, that's Eric, he does all the cool, crazy stuff. Yeah. If you watch me prep for nationals, which ended up becoming not New Zealand nationals, but garage nationals, because the lockdown happened like 3 days before I was going to fly out. You saw me starting every single session with a single on a squat, bench, or deadlift, and with just very scant accessory work, and then doing back offsets. And that's what it took for me to progress. Now, if people are watching, my plan is to compete in 2023 bodybuilding. You'll see that I do occasionally have the squat, bench, and the deadlift in there, because I don't want to get weak or unpracticed on those movements. I don't want to basically fall back too much. But 90% of what I'm doing is like cable work or dumbbell work, or various hypertrophy exercises. So it's a funny thing now, where even if you are a dual sport athlete, I think the best way to do it is to pick your spots and really think about what's the minimum dose to maintain where you were on one, while you emphasize another in a phasic fashion.
Yeah, I think that's kind of what I was drawing out of what you were saying there, is that the priority just shifts. Thing, I suppose, instead, obviously, if you're leaning towards bodybuilding, it's just allow that to be bodybuilding type of training.
Yeah.
The non
ultimately, like, it takes 5 to 7 months to get into shape for a bodybuilding show, and then it'll probably take about half that time on average to be fully recovered, put on some body fat, regain muscle mass, and go to the doctor's office and have normal values of everything if you were to get a full panel. So I think that's something you have to realize. And if you want to hold on to all your muscle mass as you go into that prep, and step on stage, the same way we maintain muscle is the same way we gain it. So you've got to have a pretty big emphasis on gaining muscle mass. And just like it takes me a full year of focusing on my big 3 to add 10 kilos to my total, it'll take me multiple years to add muscle mass. And then I've got that dieting phase, So that's why I'm like, all right, I'm going to dedicate 2021 and 2022 to putting on size, so that I've got a shot at looking better in 2023. Because before 2019, my last competition was 2011, and I was obviously bigger, better, more symmetrical. I had a similar stage weight, but far leaner. Like, I'd probably put on 5, 6, 7 pounds of muscle mass, 3, maybe 4 kilos at most, in those. But that's 8 years. It wasn't 8 years of dedicated bodybuilding training. Maybe if I'd been like a strict specialist to bodybuilding, I could have done the same thing in 2015 or 16. But I've got some years where I'm kind of just holding the line with hypertrophy and really focusing on weightlifting or powerlifting, et cetera, et cetera. I'm sure like my pecs and my quads have not suffered just because of the sports that I compete in. But yeah, I think when you're a drug-free athlete who is focusing on making improvements once they've already been in the game for a decade plus, you really have to have an appropriate time scale. You can't think about this in terms of T-Nation articles, like, or just kind of the shit you hear online about these 12-week transformations. That ain't you anymore. You done had your 12-week transformation in the first 12 weeks when you were lifting years ago. So, yeah.
So I suppose, kind of coming away from the training end of it a small bit, I suppose, what kind of attracts you to being the dual sport athlete? Because as you kind of said earlier, devoting a year to powerlifting, getting a 10 kilo PB, I I suppose if that was a lot of people, they'd be kind of like, right, that's the meet over, back into off season now, and I'm going to try and add another 10 kilos. Or as soon as they step off stage from a bodybuilding show, they're like, right, how can I make this better? So what is it that kind of brings you back to one and the other? Is it the differences in training? Is it the differences in the competing? Is it maybe you want to keep the pretty boy images downplayed as much as you can, or what's going on?
No, I want people to think of me as a pretty boy. It's not strong. That's just an accurate reflection of who I am. No, it's a little bit all of the above, minus the last joke part. I have a very different relationship with strength sport than I do with bodybuilding. And I do say relationship because I have like a visceral emotional feeling of when I'm in one mode or the other, and what competition feels like. Man, like when you hit a PR deadlift on your 9th lift, that level of adrenaline it's pretty intense. And to know all the work that's gone up to it, you know, knowing that it's always a little iffy. I pull sumo, you know, it's like there is a really cool feeling of powerlifting, and it doesn't require the same level of stress and suffering to get there. I'm not saying that powerlifting isn't hard by any means. I think the training is actually harder than, say, off-season bodybuilding training. But I've always experienced powerlifting as basically a PR party with my friends that's sanctioned, you know, like let's all get together and see how strong we are. And it's a lot of fun. And I think that's why it's grown. And I think that's why it has a great community around it. You'll have people cheering you on to hit a PR, knowing that it'll push them down a placing. It tends to, at its best, have a whole lot of unity and a lot of focus not on how strong are you, but are you busting your butt and are you hitting PRs, whether you're pulling 100 kilos on the platform or 300. I love that. And it's a community that I will always be a part of, and I feel has always been, you know, welcomed me with open arms. And it's fun and it's objective. It's nice. You know when you're getting better, and you know when you're plateaued. There's no real question to it. You don't have to rely on a panel of judges. And yeah, people complain about depth, but that's not to the same degree of, you know, a panel of judges who just arbitrarily decide if you're first, second, third, or fourth, or fifth place, right? Like bodybuilding. So powerlifting feels very different to me. It has a lower level of stress associated with committing to a meet. I get just purely more excited about it. But bodybuilding changes you. Like when you go through a contest prep, it forces you, if you want to improve on an annual basis, or I should say a competition season to season basis, you have to push yourself to get leaner, which each time you hit your limit at some point 3/4 of the way through prep, and you're like, well, that's half the race, you know? And because it does, that last quarter feels like way more than just the last quarter of prep. And you have to somehow not become an asshole in your personal life because of the stress you're putting yourself under. You aren't allowed to just quit your job during the last, you know, couple months of prep, or, you know, I mean, there are people who get fired. There are people who get divorces, you know, because of they don't know how to do this in a way that is healthy. But somehow staying human and at least the appearances of being human to the people with you, maintaining social relationships, you know, not letting the symptoms of low energy availability and overtraining just take over your whole life, which are almost inevitable. You know, operating in a functional relationship when you've got 1/8 of your normal testosterone levels, and, you know, getting up to go use the toilet feels like that was your workout session, that type of thing. There are phases in contest prep which make you reevaluate your life and your decisions. And for those who can keep the goal,
we're not selling this at all to anyone.
No. I mean, honestly, competitive bodybuilding is for very few people. It requires a tremendous amount of self-control. And the upside of that is that as you push yourself far past the limits of what you thought was possible, it is an incredible self-efficacy builder if you get through it. There's a big graveyard of people who don't, and that can just make you feel shitty with all those wonderful side benefits I talked about. So that's why I do what I do with 3D Muscle Journey, is to try to get more people more likely to get the positive benefits and to make sure that people know what they're getting into, because I didn't know what I was getting into when I started it. So anyway, that transformative experience of this bodybuilding that takes, like prep lasts, like I said, 5 to 7 months, not like kind of the 12 weeks, and it's really only hard in the peaking phase. Yeah. That is a very unique experience, and there's a reason why I competed in 07, 09, 2011, 2019, now 2023. I put a lot of distance between those because I have to kind of like forget the PTSD. No, I'm just kidding. I have to essentially be prepared. I have to set my life up. I need to make sure that I'm in a position where I'm aware of my responsibilities, and I have the mental effort and focus set aside to do this big thing. It's kind of like, I guess it's more similar to I'm going to go on some like trek through the wilderness for this whole time, this kind of spiritual discovery journey or something. Yeah. It definitely has elements of that. But anything where you're pushing yourself to your limit for an extended period, it's like an emotional marathon, if you will. And I think that I get more out of competitive bodybuilding than I do out of powerlifting in that manner. It's not that I don't get the community. I don't get that adrenaline rush. I don't get that sense of accomplishment. But you get all that, plus all of that insanity and that kind of feeling of transcending your own limits. And then you have to kind of not focus on the competition aspect because it's very subjective. Yeah. So it's this very, very different relationship I have with both sports, and that's why I'm drawn to each of them, but for very different reasons.
And kind of telling me then, I've done one, or I haven't been a dual sport athlete ever, but I have done some bodybuilding shows, and I'm powerlifting now. But I think what bodybuilding really does serve a strong purpose for is a subjective anchor of what true difficulty is. You said when you are in that final like 5-6 weeks and you're eating less food than a 4 or 5-year-old, you still have to function with the wider community. You still have all of the normal constraints of life placed upon you. It's just forevermore you'll just think back to what something actually difficult is, because like you said, like a powerlifting prep is so exciting. Like you're training, even for me anyway, like if you're training in the powerlifting club, myself and Shane training, there's a buzz, there's an atmosphere, everyone's kind of going through the same thing. There's a collective experience to a meet, whereas in bodybuilding it's very much you're probably by yourself, you're training by yourself, you're meal prepping by yourself. It's very much a solitary experience. Mm-hmm. You do spend an awful lot of time by yourself during the prep. So it does kind of make sense when you say you kind of learned a lot about yourself and you got a lot more out of a bodybuilding prep. I suppose I can kind of see how the experiences of the two are very attractive, but quite diametrically opposed in that sense.
I think it's important to kind of approach, or to kind of go about bodybuilding with the bit of caution that you wear, though, as well, because it is very glamorous now to look at people shredded at shows and be like, oh, I like training, I like the gym, I want to jump into that as well, without kind of really knowing what people are getting into. And I suppose you could look at, like, obviously on the untested side and see how quickly people may prep for them shows with like the use of assistance. Whereas like if you're looking at like an actual bodybuilding prep, like you're talking about 6 months of your life. Like most people find it difficult to diet for 12 weeks, never mind for half the year.
Yeah, and it's not even necessarily easier for the untested guys and gals. They're on a lot of substances potentially that are mitigating some of those side effects and allowing them to hang on to a lot of muscle mass, but they still have to create a calorie deficit to lose all that body fat. So they're essentially just crash dieting for 12 weeks while running a whole bunch of hormones, so they go crazy too, don't get me wrong. And it just is a little more intense of an experience rather than a prolonged slow slide into madness. So yeah, it's rough stuff. And there are probably better ways to do it. Like you could probably just meditate and read more and think about, your values, or you can starve yourself for fun. So I think, you've got multiple avenues to get to, some pseudo enlightenment out there. But yeah, bodybuilding, it has that very unique element. And, Lawrence, you were mentioning your experience. It is very solitary. And I think there's something to be said with spending a lot of time in your own head, at least for periods. But there's also something to be said for spending time with the community, working towards a collective competition, having that buzz. And I think they complement each other quite well. I like them. And I think that's what dictates what I emphasize or what I focus on. When I get the itch for one or the other, I lean into those experiences and I seek them out, which I think is very positive. But, Shane, to your point, Instagram shows a lot of people in contest shape, but does a terrible job of actually expressing that experience. It makes it seem very glamorous. It makes it almost sound like powerlifting. Like, hey, this is all great. We all do a 12-week transformation. Everybody looks fantastic. We go party on the beach, and somehow there's a Ferrari in the background. Like, none of that happens. Like, you spend a lot of time trying not to be depressed on a treadmill and wanting to eat more protein oats. Like, it's not glamorous, So yeah, I think there's a huge difference between social media diet culture and competitive bodybuilding for sure. And I think that is, you'll have a rude awakening if you're expecting the former when you get into the reality of it. But yeah, I think it should be something that you go into with intention. That's for sure. And I think for first timers, where you really don't know what to expect, you definitely want to try to find some other people who are doing the same thing, so you can, help get connected with the right resources, understand what competences you'll have, and have a little less insecurity and fear as you go through the experiences that you might, like, if you don't even know that they're going to happen and you don't know what it feels like, that can be like, oh my God, is this my reality now? Am I going to be hungry forever? Am I always going to feel like I have lead legs? But at the very least, if you have a coach or a supportive community, they can at least normalize that experience for you. It kind of takes the edge off of that fear. So yeah, but nonetheless, they can be combined, but I think they need to be looked at from more than just the X's and O's of nutrition or training, and kind of thought about as, why am I doing these things and how do I want to approach them long term?
I think that's a great piece of advice for someone to kind of take from away from you, more than any kind of science literature or science communication, which is excellent, by the way, from you, but is that your motivations and doing something like something that you said there that just like sticks out at me so much, is being in the right place in life to go into a powerlifting prep, or being in the right place in life to go into a bodybuilding prep. Like, so much has to be said for that. Maybe like when you're a year into your or into your final year of your undergrad, or if you have a baby on the way or something like that, these life constraints, I suppose, are imposing themselves upon you, and starting a prep for something mightn't be the best idea.
Yeah, you got to have some big picture self-discipline. I really think you do. Not that this is the right decision for everyone, but when I moved to New Zealand and I said, all right, I've been doing an MPhil, Master's of Philosophy, and then a PhD. I'm not going to do a competitive bodybuilding season during that period. So, that's why there was 2011 and 2019. That was the gap. And it would have been 2018 if I hadn't needed to get hip surgery. Yeah. So, because I finished my PhD in 2017. So I think that's the type of thinking, like, I don't think competitive bodybuilding is great for natural competitive bodybuilding is great for someone if they can't think about competitive goals that aren't a decade from now,
Yeah.
Because that's how long it takes. And then you have to figure out how to plan it with your life, because you're going to have things in your life that are going to be different a decade from now. You might have no kids now and kids then, a 9-to-5 contracting job now, and then a career or a business you own then, or whatever that looks like. And because it has such an effect on your life, you have to really try to integrate the two, or they can have a negative effect on one another. That's for sure.
Deadly. I suppose what would be kind of, when you say that integrative approach, is there any kind of, like, before when you introduced yourself, you were kind of, I was kind of there listing off the things that you were involved in, and you were obviously involved in so many things. Is there anything kind of advice you could give somebody, or maybe even how you employ that kind of integrative approach to yourself?
Absolutely. I think the biggest one is, ultimately a lot of what we do comes down to the relationships we keep, be it with family, friends, colleagues, and bodybuilding is weird, right? Like, it's generally going to be misunderstood, mischaracterized. People often see bodybuilders as, vain, self-absorbed, and it's, that's a funny thing, because I don't get like social rewards for looking like I do. As like a natural bodybuilder, I tell someone bodybuilder, I think I'm too small, and then when I get shredded, they think I have a disease, like, because I look so sunken into my face. So I get like accolades from within my own community when I'm on stage, when I show stage pics, but most of the time, it is something that people just think is kind of strange, like you're moonlighting as a competitive stripper, like what's going on? You're wearing a Speedo. It's not something that is really accepted by society. It's very strange. Most people, you say bodybuilding, they don't know you actually have to dive into a show. They think you're trying to get bigger into the show, or they confuse it with powerlifting. And then when they say powerlifting, they're actually doing like an overhead press with their hands. And it's very clear they don't know what you're doing. So I think it's important to have conversations, especially with people you're close to, like your family and your significant others. And this is something I've seen as a coach and experienced in my own personal life, is that when those lines of communication aren't open, you can get people who are derisive, offended, non-supportive at best, sometimes things like that. And I think the error most people make is they think they need to make, or they want family or friends who are actually fans of bodybuilding. And that's rare. I think being a fan of bodybuilding is probably just as rare as competing in it. Like, shows are not that fun. Like, it's mostly other competitors and their family sitting in the audience. Let's go to a high school auditorium to watch a whole bunch of people, stand and then turn,
So anticlimactic, I think, if you were to go to a bodybuilding meet and you're sitting there, like, one commentary a lot of people kind of have when they go to a powerlifting meet, if they've only kind of gone to bodybuilding meets or they haven't gone to one before, is the energy. And like you said there earlier, which was definitely very true, is that nobody wants to see us fail a lift. There's no the level of ego that tends to be attached to powerlifting is a lot less, and there's a lot more kind of an investment in the other person's lifts. Whereas if you go to a bodybuilding show, it's generally quite silent. You might have one loud minority in a corner, but for the most part, it's people's mums and dads and grandmothers who really don't even know what they're looking at.
No. They've seen the fourth most muscular hit to Metallica today and the fourth sassy stage walk to a Beyonce song today. They're ready to go home. But why are they there? And this is my point that I was getting to. They want to support you because they care about you, right? And I think it's not your job to make them fans of bodybuilding. That's quite an uphill battle. But you do want to help them understand that it is important to you at the very least, and maybe why it's important to you, what you get out of it, and why you do it. That way, they will do things like, oh, I'm making dinner. Do you want me to set aside a portion thing? Or like, how do you want to operate with that? Or, hey, I want to make sure we're still going out. And maybe this is a conversation you start. Would it be better if we went to a movie instead of dinner tonight? Or like, how do we not have, our lives get too negatively affected by this or turbulent? And one of the things that I tell a lot of young competitors is, don't expect the world to change for you. Like, you're deciding to starve yourself, for your own personal goals. Don't get mad when your roommate has pizza. Like, when he has to stop eating pizza because you want to be in a Speedo, like, get off your fucking high horse, right? So the goal, I say to a lot of people to do bodybuilding responsibly, is, hey, try to make it so that people don't know you're competing until it's just blatantly obvious, because you don't have any body fat in your cheeks, like the old stealth prep. Not that you're trying to hide it from them, but you're trying to make your decisions for yourself not have an impact on the people around you. That's simple, right? Seems pretty moral and ethical, but it also forces you to approach it a little differently. It also, by doing that, you have to think about constantly, how am I now in prep compared to how I was, quote unquote, normally? And you can start to become more aware with this kind of one step removed observer of how am I changing socially? How is my behavior the same as it was? And that can help you be aware of the effects of it on you, and what you're comfortable with, what you're not, what to work on next time. Every prep, I think there are opportunities to improve, even if like you didn't actually get better in terms of your actual appearance. Maybe you were able to better balance work-life stress, or you had to apologize less to your significant other, or what have you. I think those are really the gold that you can get from the process. But you have to be intentional and aware rather than completely absorbed in the process, which is very normal for first-time competitors, and unfortunately normal for some folks who really kind of live the life.
Yeah, that sounds like a very well thought out approach to integrating strength sports, bodybuilding into your life. And you're definitely someone that's talking from an extensive amount of experience there as well. You just sound really, as I said, well thought out, and you have a really good grasp on your motivations, it sounds like. That, and it relates back to what you said earlier, that you clearly get a lot out of bodybuilding, and you clearly get a lot out of powerlifting, because it sounds like you're doing it for all the right reasons.
I like to think so. I'm doing it for my reasons, and I've helped a lot of people hopefully figure out their own reasons and do it for those reasons as well. But a lot of people don't even ask the question why,
Yeah, very true. You need to know why you're doing it at the end of the day. Anyway, was there anything else we were going to touch on? I think that just about wraps it up.
I think that's everything.
Yeah. Anyway, so I better wrap it up. So thank you very much, Eric, for that. That was amazing. Definitely provide a ton of value. I definitely have taken something from it, because I am planning on competing in bodybuilding next year. So yeah, making the leap. But anyway, obviously you should tell everybody where they can find you, the many places they can find you.
Well, there is probably one good one-stop shop, and that is 3dmusclejourney.com. That is the number 3, the letter D, then musclejourney.com. And then from there, that's kind of like a hub. You can find links to my books, The Muscle and Strength Pyramids. You can find a link to my research review that I'm a part of, Monthly Applications in Strength Sport. We have a blog there. We have links to our podcast there. We have links to our Instagrams for each one of the people who are part of 3DMJ. Mine is at Helms 3DMJ. And the only place that isn't maybe directly linked on 3dmusclejourney.com is the podcast that I do regularly with Omar Isuf. That's Iron Culture, where we kind of take a broad look at all things within that umbrella, the history, science, and culture of lifting, from all the different disciplines to everything that even loosely is related to pumping iron. So definitely check out all that.
Perfect.
Yeah. That was an amazing conversation. Thanks so much for coming on. I suppose definitely from me anyway, big fanboy. Kind of when I suppose when I kind of got into bodybuilding and kind of taking competitive bodybuilding or powerlifting a little bit more seriously, I suppose looking at you, you were kind of one of the first academics, I suppose, as well, that had a foot in both camps, and a lot of the research you put out was obviously very helpful at different points of my undergrad and my PhD as well. So just the work you're doing is phenomenal, and thanks so much for coming on.
Yeah, it's a true honor. Thank you. I appreciate that. It's great to hear.
Yeah, Matt August was my gateway drug back in 2014. So yeah, on the right path.
The gateway drug to many. Shout out Matt August.
We didn't have the internet connectivity at home for me to watch any YouTube. I was divided at.
Perfect. Right. Thank you very much for listening. I hope you really enjoyed the episode. So if you did enjoy the episode, definitely make sure to share it on your Instagram stories or whatever social media app you use. Make sure to leave a rating and definitely tag us if you have watched it, because we don't get many tags. Right. So that's it. Thank you very much. And we'll talk to you in the next one.